Thank you, Kurt. I'm going to add slightly to Kurt's introduction. As you have heard, one of our goals in the county party is to encourage citizen advocacy. And as someone who strives to advocate for public education, which typically means accosting people in the soup aisle, you are my mentors. I am pinching myself up here. You guys, you three, are in the trenches, making real change for our children, and therefore all of our futures. On behalf of Douglas County Democrats, I want to say thank you and that you are appreciated. Thank you. You also represent some pretty big acronyms, and for those of us that may not be completely familiar with the work you are doing, I'd like to ask you to just give a quick 2 or 3 minute explanation of the purpose of your group and perhaps some of your big goals that we can help you with this legislative session.
Okay, well, I'm the union guy, so I'm it's always nice. That's because I put money in the hat, isn't it? It's not. This is the first speaking engagement I had to pay to be at. So I'm kind of upset about that. I work for the Kansas National Education Association, which is the state teachers union, and my job is the lobbyist. I'm the chief lobbyist. We have another lobbyist, and then I do work a little bit in politics during the campaign. I'm particularly on the side of things that does not engage with candidates, but does stuff independently of those races. So that's what I do in my day job. I'm also I've had 4 kids, went through the Lawrence Public Schools, all graduated from Free State High, and all left. Basically, well, no, they didn't all leave. 3 left out of 4. So it'd be nice if people would want to stay in Kansas, and that's essentially what I'm trying to do, is get more support for our public schools, increase that, make Kansas a better place to live, which is why I work so closely with people like Annie.
I don't know that I'm necessarily making Kansas a better place to live, but at Kansas Action for Children, we've been around for almost 40 years, and our mission is to make Kansas the best state to raise a child. And to that end, we advocate around education, health, and economic policy. For years, we've been fighting the battle to save our early education system, the Children's Initiative Fund. And as a result of the governor's failed tax policy, we've made more than $100 million in cuts to programs that serve little kids. This year, knowing that we were yet again going to face another proposal by the governor to sell out little kids, we decided to put all of our might behind trying to pass comprehensive tax reform. And along with the Kansas Center for Economic Growth and KNEA and some other partners, we launched an effort last fall called Rise Up Kansas, which I know many of you are familiar with. We are dangerously close to passing comprehensive tax reform this legislative session, and understand that everything that we talk about here today is underscored by the resources we have available for it. And we will only have resources available to support programs for kids and public education and higher education and all the other things that matter to us if we pass comprehensive tax reform. So I ask of you that you also put your voice behind those efforts. We obviously have a stellar delegation representing our community here in Lawrence, but it will be as important to reach out to others. I'm sure you have friends across the state and can reach into other communities. I know we can accomplish it this session, and then we can begin to repair the damage that has been done by the governor and his allies.
Good morning. My name's Ann Mah. I represent District 4, which includes the western half of Douglas County, all of Senator Francisco's territory. I'm just thrilled to be on the state board because this is a great time. There's so much going on, particularly with the school funding issue. And the state board has been very active. We now have a great commissioner. I don't know if you've met him, Dr. Randy Watson. And the man led us throughout the state to visit with people all over the state and develop a vision that's based on what the people and the parents and the teachers of Kansas and the business owners want. And it's an awesome vision. If you didn't get one, I brought a handout today. We developed that vision, and we set out what we would measure that would ensure that every child would succeed and Kansas would lead the world in student success. And that's that's not just hooey. We really believe that can happen. It's our moonshot vision for Kansas. And so last summer, the board set out how much money we thought it would take to make this happen based on the Gannon decisions, based on our vision, based on the Rose capacities, and what our priorities are. We have a really good board right now. They are very student-centered, very positive group fighting for the right things. And we have been over there virtually every day fighting for a good funding formula. And we've had some very good conversations with people. I'll talk more about this later as we get into the details, but thrilled to be on the board working there for our kids.
Thank you. So today we are addressing, once again, funding in public education, and we're trying to do that in 60 minutes, which is quite an undertaking. So we are also asking for questions for the audience, so I wanted to set that parameter, and I also would like to leave a few minutes at the end of the session to talk about other legislation proposed this session that would affect public education. So the big name, Gannon. The court has now ruled on equity and adequacy and found that schools are underfunded. What does that mean? Maybe a little background, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, schools are underfunded. It's not a surprise to anybody that works in schools that they're underfunded. We no longer have the formula that had base state aid in it, but we kind of measure everything by what was under that formula. We've been... Wow.
We're in a school.
Yeah, saving money. It's all about efficiency. Under the old formula, after the Montoy decision, which was in 2005, that also found schools were inadequately funded, the legislature eventually caved in and responded to that decision by dramatically increasing funding for schools over a initially 3-year, eventually 4-year phase-in. We got our base state aid up as high as $4,400 per pupil. It had started out in '92 at, I believe, $3,600. So $4,400 after that many years is not a lot, not a huge gain, but it was a significant gain at the time. We're now down to just over $3,800. Part of that loss was in response to the Great Recession, the economic collapse that we had. We all knew, and those of us who advocate for public schools, we knew in 2008 and 9 that we were going to lose money. There was just no way that the state could sustain things under the economic collapse. We also expected that that money would be returned once the economy recovered. And of course, what happened instead is that the governor managed to con the Senate and eventually the House into passing his Laffer-inspired economic plan, tax plan, and we have a self-imposed greater recession since that time in 2012 when that passed. The result of that is that we've never put more money back into schools, the money lost during the economic recession, and indeed we have lost more since then as the legislature and the governor continue to advocate for this failed policy and balance budgets by stealing, robbing, moving, switching, renaming, whatever you want to call it. That brings us to Gannon, which has again decided, yeah, indeed, you're underfunded. In the lower court's decision, I want to point out that they were very clear because the state's argument was, we just don't have the money to do this. And the court said, yes, you did. You just chose to give it away in tax cuts instead of fund your schools. So your excuse doesn't hold up. That was a decision that was in the lower court's decision. So we're at a point right now, and the decision has been out for what, 2 weeks? About 2 weeks? That says the schools are inadequately funded. no one was surprised. I had I advised my bosses that we'd have a week of bloviating in the Capitol building about, oh, the courts are, but we didn't get any of that this time because I think no one was shocked at the decision. They all know that we're inadequately funded. The problem we face is, as Annie said in her opening remarks, we literally do not have the money to respond to the court in schools. We don't have the money to fund social services or hospitals or anything else in the state, but we certainly don't have the money right now to respond to that. Which leads us to, as Annie said, our number one job right now is to change that. We have to reverse the disastrous tax experiment that Brownback put onto this state. Concurrent with that, we have to write a new school finance formula. And that work, actually, we may see a bill early this week, maybe as early as Monday, about where the House might want to go on school funding. I think we're pleased to say that it's probably going to look a lot like the 92 formula, because what they figured out is, gosh, it wasn't so bad after all. It kind of makes sense. So we're headed in that direction. And in proof that elections do matter, we believe the House at least is more than ready to do what Annie was talking about in comprehensive tax reform, and one of my primary issues this year, which is a school finance formula that does respond to the needs that schools have. So we're moving forward, but we have to accomplish both of these tasks, and we have to do it in short order because the court has to be able to review that new school finance formula by June 30th. The deadline is June 30th, but that's the deadline by which the court needs to be able to review it, not the legislature can wait till the 30th to pass it. They have to give it to the court for review to see if it will pass muster. So it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks over the next 2 weeks. So if there's any teachers out there who are off on spring break, it's a great time to come up to the Capitol. We'd love to see you up there. But we'll have a lot to report over the next couple of weeks on the direction this is taking. So.
Yeah, and I think there were some other interesting things in the court order as well. They looked at both inputs and outcomes, and they spoke a lot to how the bottom 25% of African American students and 30% of Hispanic students were not achieving proficiency. Another cool thing they talked about was how things like extracurricular activities, the arts, librarians, speech therapists, vocational training, technology, coaches, and counselors, all these things are necessary for student success. Because we still have, even though I think the House will probably come up with a good education bill, there are still a number of them in there who are not saying we need to spend more. In fact, their mantra is, the court didn't say we needed to spend more. They just said we need to fix these things. So it will be an interesting debate, and it looks like on the Senate side that finally got started this week, learning how to spell school funding, which is about where they are. I mean, the chairman looked surprised. I mean, his eyes were glazing over as they're going over the history of school funding. I thought, oh my gosh. But maybe the good news is he kind of implied that they might just work from the House bill. Even though I know Senator Hensley has introduced a school funding formula that looks very much like 2270. I'm sure you've got some information out there about that. We're hopeful that what the House does looks something like that, and then we do have some ideas on the Senate side to actually improve that. But if they started with that in the Senate, that probably wouldn't be a bad thing, rather than doing some of the things that the Senate chair has implied, like maybe taking the Missouri formula, which would be a disaster and not constitutional in Kansas. So it'll be an interesting debate going forward. I don't know what Mark's impression was, but I don't expect anything really to come out until they get to the veto session. Do you think that both houses, they stand a chance of doing anything?
I think the House might.
Yeah, but I don't think the Senate will. I mean, they were talking the other day like they would at least like to see it before they took their April break. So it'll be an interesting debate.
Just to piggyback on that, I would say that number one, most people glaze over in a discussion of school finance, so that's not necessarily, that's not unusual. At 2270, by the way, which is the bill that Ann referenced, is a very good school finance formula bill that the education organizations are all supporting. It was drafted by Republican Melissa Rooker in the House and Democrat Laura Kelly in the Senate. It's their bill. The one that Anthony introduced is essentially the same bill with a couple of fixes that the House sponsors, Melissa in particular, also agreed with and worked on with Anthony and Laura to get cleaned up for the Senate version. So we do have good bills sitting there right now in both chambers.
Thank you. That took care of like my next 3 questions. That was wonderful. Let me say, the first item on the budget was closing out the 2017 deficit and delays payments to K-12 schools, as well as delaying $150 million in payments to KPERS. As we've obviously established, we have already made cuts to education. In Eudora, it meant many things, including losing 9 teaching positions and 9.5 coaching positions, and incorporating fees for the first time. Here in USD 497, we lost over 25 teaching positions, and we started spending from our deficit spending, which is our reserve funds or our one-time monies. And I'm sure throughout the state there are many, many more districts in the same situation. As part of that conversation this week, as for closing out 2017, Susan Wago, the Senate Majority Leader, wanted to make cuts, President, thank you, wanted to make cuts, mid-year cuts to our schools. Are we done with that conversation? Is that ongoing, and how does that affect schools in Kansas?
Well, the cuts were very interesting. The initial cuts that were considered were 5% cuts to K-12. Those were so unwelcome in the Senate that they pulled them off the floor and never even voted on them. Susan attempted, the committee would not do the cuts for 2017. You understand? She said they're mid-year cuts. Well, mid-year was a long time ago. These are end-of-year cuts, all of which would have had to be made up in the last few months of the year. They would have been devastating to every state agency and to schools. The 2% cut proposed by Wagle failed. It only got 7 votes in the Senate. It was pared back to a 1% cut, which only got 10 votes, and then a 0.5% cut, which only got 6 votes. So the Senate, which is, I would deem to be slightly more conservative than the House, maybe a good deal more conservative than the House, if that's all they can get in the Senate after a lengthy debate, with the Senate President leading the charge, that my belief is that cuts for 2017 are now off the table. It's just, at least in terms of the senators or and they would never pass the House anyway, but in terms of the Senate trying again. If the governor does allotments, I don't know, that may be a different thing, but I believe that the cuts for 2017 are now off the table. The other issues in the rescission bill are, there's a lot of bad stuff in that. The KPERS part especially alarms us as advocates for school employees, particularly because it's interesting that the governor and his allies have advocated for a couple of years now that KPERS is school funding. And here they've just cut $150 million then in, I guess it's school funding that they cut, and $100 million the year before. On other issues, how would it play out? I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's cute that you think that there's logic applied to what they're doing up there, but felt like you've been at this longer, Mark. I want to go back to this notion of, are we done talking about school cuts? I think Mark's right. I think we're done talking about it for 2017, but we'll only be done talking about it in future years if we restore revenue to the state. That's the only way we stand a chance of keeping our schools open, of stopping raiding KPERS and the gimmicks and measures. And certainly when the legislature came into session, they had sort of the least of bad options. The governor proposed selling out the Children's Initiative Fund, which supports our early childhood programs, payday loan style. So the moves that the legislature ultimately did make, while maybe not fiscally sound, I think did the probably maybe least amount of harm. But if we want to end this practice of robbing Peter to pay Paul, then we've got to do something this session around comprehensive tax reform. Because since coming out of the Great Recession, we've had 9 consecutive rounds of budget cuts. We need this to be our last round of budget cuts. And I think back to 2015 when we last played this little game of cutting mid-year and what it meant to schools then. We had schools around the state that closed up shop early. We had a superintendent down in the south central part of the state who gave up their paycheck at the end of the year to make sure they could make payroll. We've shoved more little bodies into classrooms throughout the state. We've reduced extracurricular activities, and it's been a long game. We have a chance to end that and to put us back on solid fiscal footing. And so I think that's pretty exciting when we look at this. The other thing that I just want to point out is that when Ann mentioned in the Gannon decision, they broke down outcomes based on some different demographic measures and showed that there was, we were not achieving the same results for all Kansas kids. Candidly, that's not a surprise to me. Because when I look at how we're investing in early education across the state, I look at the fact that we only are serving 8% of eligible children in early Head Start. That means 92% of Kansas kids who are eligible for early Head Start don't have a seat. Programs like that are the gap closers, and we've been cutting them, which places a greater burden on our K-12 system. I was pleased to see that Gannon mentioned early education, pleased that the state board has talked about all-day kindergarten, but know that we are only going to achieve great things for all Kansas kids if we look at investing in early education as well as K-12 schools. So, food for thought.
So, Annie, you've mentioned losing the CIF a couple of times now. Could you explain just a little more about what that funds and what we will lose?
I too brought a handout, so it's at the outside if you all want to take a look at it. The Children's Initiative Fund has been a revenue stream in Kansas for nearly 20 years. Back in the late 90s, Kansas joined a lawsuit along with more than 40 other states against major tobacco companies, because costs to states as a result of tobacco usage were growing. And so states banded together, sued master tobacco companies, and had the largest settlement in US history. At the time, back in 1999, many of the states did not believe that those tobacco companies would keep paying out. And tobacco companies are required to make an annual payment in perpetuity or indefinitely. So as long as people are smoking or using tobacco products, and this is not a promotional campaign, by the way, this is not a smoking for Kansas kids, but the point is, so long as there is tobacco usage, those companies have to make this annual payment. And so, so back at in the late 1990s, many states just didn't believe that that was going to happen, and so they took the money and run, kind of like a lottery summit. They took a lump sum up front. And then some states, like Kansas, said, you know, we'll go ahead and receive that annual payment. But no state did what we did. No state had the forethought to say, how can we use those monies most effectively? Most states just put it into their general fund for whatever operating costs they needed, but Kansas locked into statute that we would use that annual payment to support our early education system. And so since 1999, we've been receiving on average about $60 million a year and investing it in early education programs across the state. Not only capital E education through the State Department of Ed, but also through Aging and Disability Services, through our Kansas Department of Health and Environment, through Department for Children and Families. Those programs cross all systems. They're early childhood mental health programs. They're home visiting programs for first-time parents, for at-risk kids. It's a newborn hearing aid loaner program. We detect and catch developmental delays and address them. It's a gap closer. For every dollar that we invest in early childhood education, there's an average of $11 return. And so the idea was that if we invested here, we would be preparing kids ready to enter kindergarten. Unfortunately, since the governor enacted his disastrous failed tax policy, we have been balancing the budget on the backs of little kids in K-12 and higher ed. That's a well-told story. But what we've also seen there is diminished opportunities for Kansas kids and increasing costs and burden on our K-12 system. Since we've been down this path, and since we've made cuts to early education in K-12, we're starting to see the outcomes from that. Last summer, we produced a report along with the Annie E. Casey Foundation called the Kids Count Report. And Kansas fell from 13th to 30th in fourth grade reading proficiency. 13th to 30th. That is a direct result of cutting early education programs and cutting K-12. The way we reverse that, the way we catch up with our peers, is to ensure that we have the resources to invest in those programs, to make sure that it's not 8% of eligible kids in early Head Start, but we've got 100% of kids accessing early Head Start. We have a long way to go to achieve that vision. This is not going to happen overnight, but when I think about where I want us to get to as a state, to return to being aspirational again, starting with tax policy and creating the resources we have to restore support to those programs, I think about what we can accomplish for our kids in 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years. It would be remarkable and something that we haven't experienced before. So I'm excited for that. And I know also the conversations around early education have grown to include more collaborations with our State Department of Ed as well as our state school board in prioritizing those things.
Thank you. Ann, you mentioned student outcomes and a little bit about funding, and I'm wondering, how do the funding decisions affect how the Board of Education makes its decisions? How do we continue to be progressive? And how, as citizen advocates, could we support the Board of Education, or can we?
Thank you. Well, we can't make the vision happen if we don't have the funding. And the state board is tracking with everything these folks are saying. It all starts with early childhood education. And so it's no surprise that kindergarten readiness is one of the things that we're going to measure. We're going to measure this stuff. And we'll see how the funding comes out. Here's what we've asked for. If we get this money, then we can make these things happen. And we can hold schools accountable for making them happen. We just approved the other day a tool for measuring kindergarten readiness that we're really excited about, that we hope to get funding for. It's not an expensive program, and it's not like a test to keep kids out of kindergarten. It's a tool to help schools get ready for the kids they're going to get, and that's where it starts. But we also have a new accountability system, a new accreditation system to make sure that schools really do improve their services and their outcomes with kids. We're working on really exciting new stuff. We've got a new access to data. One of the things that people told us when we went around the state is when we said, well, what does a successful high school graduate look like to you? And, a lot of parents said, well, they're not in my basement anymore. That would be success for me. They're happy, they're successful, they've got a job. And so we are going to track every class in every high school for 7 years after graduation to see what happened to them. Did they go to school? Did they get a certificate? Did they get any kind of training at all? And we've got that data now. We just looked at it the other day for the class of 2010. And just as an insight, because most of the other classes aren't any different, we know that we need at least 71% of Kansas workers to have some kind of post-secondary training, either a college degree, an associate's degree, or some kind of certificate. And when we looked at the class of 2010, 6 years later, only 39% of them had completed anything. But we're going to have this data by high school. Now, the state board is going to take some responsibility for what happens the first 2 years out. We think that if we do a good enough job, and we know we've got great teachers and great schools who want to make it happen, but we can improve what kids are doing at least 2 years out. After that, there are a lot of things out of our control, but that is going to be our focus. We're going to measure it. But we need your support too in talking to your local school districts. Are they do they have an accountability system? Are they looking at the results for kids disaggregated in all these demographics that we care about? What are they doing to encourage kids in high school to have an individual plan of study, which is really key to helping kids know when they come out of high school. Our goal is for every child to have an individual plan of study that we're going to start right now in 8th grade with assessments. We have a tool to use for that. We want every child to succeed, but we need your help talking to your local school districts. What are we doing for kindergarten readiness? I know the Seaman School District last week voted to make a huge step forward with that. They're going to have a whole school dedicated to pre-K students. They want to grow that from, what do they have, Mark, 180 some? They want to get it up to over 300 by 2020. So districts can do this. Whether or not the state funds it, it's a matter of priorities, right? And so we'll see how the funding comes out, and then the board may have to adjust what we're going to tackle first. But this is the goal. It's a moonshot. We intend to fight for the whole loaf of bread. And then if we don't get it, we'll see what happens there. But we need you to help us hold your local school districts accountable for all these things.
Okay. Well, we know that we need to help end the tax experiment and support a new tax structure, which we may get to fight for soon, we hope. We'll pay attention to that. Mark, what other legislation is coming down the pipeline that could affect public education so that we can be vigilant and ready to support or oppose it?
Well, I have a ton of things I can talk about here. First is that we're going to see the first, what's called the chairman's bill in the House side on school funding. We only have a vague idea what that's going to look like, although the chairman, Larry Campbell, has told his committee, bring every amendment you want. We know there will be a voucher amendment. Brenda Landwehr out of Wichita has already announced she's going to bring that because, you know, the best way to deal with this 25% of kids that aren't making it is to send them to homeschooling and unaccredited schools at taxpayer cost. So we're going to have an amendment on that. We're going to have probably amendments that we would consider anti-teacher amendments. There has already been talk about merit pay amendments, limiting teacher pay amendments, and so on. You know, everything you can imagine will be proposed in amendments, either in the committee or on the floor. In the committee, they stand a slight chance of winning, although we think that common sense will prevail on most things in the committee, but it's a very tight committee in terms of the moderate Republican and Democrat coalition in that committee is maybe 1 or 2 votes larger than the conservative Republican group in that committee. And as a consequence, sometimes moderates, Democrats, we know where they're going to be. We believe we know where the moderates will be, but occasionally one will flake off and will lose a vote. We feel pretty good about what will happen in the House because the votes on the House floor seem to be pretty solidly aligned against the anti-schools agenda. There are other things out there. I want to talk because I think legislation is out there that will affect the teacher shortage in Kansas. And what you need to understand is that there is an extreme teacher shortage in Kansas. A few years ago, when we were talking about returning to work after retirement, they put something about the state board would identify shortage areas. They identified elementary education as a shortage area, which is unheard of because that's where the majority of education majors go, elementary ed. We had a shortage in elementary education. That's appalling. That says that our shortage is terrible. We also have an older teaching force, a lot of people close to retirement, and believe it or not, over the last 4 years, they're leaving in droves. They've had it. They're leaving in enormous numbers. At the same time, enrollment in our education colleges is rapidly declining. So we are not training new teachers. We're losing our veteran teachers, and we're surprised there's a teacher shortage. And I will tell you that Randy Watson, the commissioner, has appeared before every education committee this year, and he said, you want to know why there's a teacher shortage? You want to know why nobody's going into education anymore? Because Teachers feel abused and attacked and belittled by the people in Topeka. And they have been attacked and belittled. They were stripped of due process protections at 4 o'clock in the morning 2 years ago. We're struggling to get that reinstated. And frankly, any school district that has not negotiated the due process protection is contributing to the teacher shortage in this state. These are the kinds of things that when legislators say, how do we support teachers? And Randy Watson, to his credit, has been saying, you have to stop the war on teachers. You have to stop doing this. I would have not expected the Commissioner of Education to be so forceful about calling it an attack on teachers. Teachers feel undervalued. They're underpaid. They haven't had raises in years for the most part, or minimal ones. They're seeing attacks on their health care benefits right now, plans to consolidate them into high deductible plans that will be unaffordable. Just attack after attack after attack. We have managed to get a due process bill through the House. The Senate is stalling and not planning to do anything about it. So we have to fight these things every day on behalf of teachers. Frankly, if we don't, what Ann has and what the board is doing is tremendous work. I've been listening to Randy's presentations and Jim McNeese and Mr. Porter and everybody else do their presentations. They're doing great work, but it's all, and we can put the money in, but it's all for naught if we can't get really, really good teachers in every classroom. All the support people that Ann talked about, counselors and occupational therapists and speech therapists and paraprofessionals. If we can't get those people in our schools, it doesn't matter what else we do. We can put all the money we want in. If we can't hire teachers, if we can't staff our schools with the best people available, we'll fail. And we can't do that if we don't show the greatest respect to our teachers. We got to pay them well. We got to give them some job security. We got to worship our teachers. Frankly. So I think it's critical as we talk to legislators. There are a lot of legislators that just think everything's fine with teachers. They're overpaid. They don't work very hard. They're out. They're gone. There's teachers out here. Right? The parking lot's empty by 2:30 in the afternoon. They've all gone to happy hour. And I taught 13 years. I know Lois taught, Steve taught. We know, and there's several of you out there. You know what it's like. We have to turn people around and turn every legislator around. It's time to stop the war on teachers and do the funding part, the tax part that Annie's talking about, and the funding part that Ann has talked about. If we do all of those things, we can achieve this moonshot vision that Ann's talking about. But if we leave one of them out, we fail. And we will fail Kansas for generations if we do that.
And Mark brings up a lot of it. The board is just, I can't be more pleased with what Commissioner Watson's been doing, his leadership and his vision. But one of the board's goals, of course, will be to put a quality teacher in front of every child. And another thing that happens across the street from where we meet is that we have people saying, oh, anybody could teach. So the battle for keeping strong standards for teacher licensure goes on, and that's one thing I'm really paying attention to. In fact, somebody made a proposal that we should have a general science certificate for high school. And I thought, I think an inch deep and a mile wide is not a great plan for teaching science in high school. So, these things come up and we have to be vigilant. The school board last fall had a blue ribbon study done. It was a great group of people got together to talk about teacher supply and retention. What could we do? And it's at the ksde.org website. Look for blue ribbon study. But they came out with 65 recommendations. Some things the state board could do, some things your local board could do, some things the legislature needs to do. I mean, the biggest shortage is Southwest Kansas, as you might guess. But guess where the other one is? Kansas City. I don't know how many hundred teachers they started short this year. They just can't get qualified teachers. And I know Cindy Kane is doing yeoman's work over there trying to get people trained up. But there are things your local board can do as well. The state board took the recommendations for us and prioritized them. The first one we're working on is mentoring, trying to get every school. I know every school probably does something in mentoring, but we're looking at the timing of it and thinking, some of them, they say, well, we'll have a mentor in place by October. As Mark knows, by October, they may be thinking about getting out of here already. So, we're trying to work on mentoring as a number one priority. But there are things local districts can do too, as you can imagine in Southwest Kansas, and not even there, probably around here in small towns like Perry. We asked them why they had a shortage. They said they have nowhere to live. Decent, affordable housing is a problem for young teachers, particularly in small areas. So these things all, play together to keep our shortage down. But I think Mark mentioned the biggest one. There's no surprise that we have thousands fewer students going into education programs now than we did 4 years ago. And that's going to really hit hard as the baby boomers really get out of there. There's also a bill in the House, 138, to help after retirement. There's a big problem right now. A lot of teachers would like to go back to work, and some small districts, I know a friend of mine, superintendent in Elk Valley, a third of his teachers are retirees. So that's an issue too. A lot of things going on in this area, but the number one thing is what Mark said. We need to respect and pay teachers the professional salaries that we know they deserve.
Absolutely. We have a question about block grant funding. Is just a quick synopsis of that maybe, and if it's still something we should be concerned with?
The block grant is the school finance plan that was enacted on the repeal of the 1992 school finance plan. The block grant essentially said what you had the previous year you would have for 2 years. It did not make, the problems with it included the fact that it makes no adjustments whatsoever for declining enrollment or growing enrollment. So a school district that gets 200 new students in a year has the same money they had with 200 fewer students the year before. On the other hand, a school district that lost 100 students gets more per pupil in the next year because it's all just flat for 2 years. The block grant it was essentially saying, as I would put it, it's 2 years without a school finance plan. It just gave you a chunk of money, what you had the year before, and said, make do for the next 2 years. It sunsets on June 30th, which is why the court set June 30th as the date by which this has to be fixed. If we don't have a new school finance formula in place by June 30th, we have no school finance formula going forward, which is why if we look at what potentially could happen, without a school finance formula, there is no way to distribute the funding for schools, which means come the 1st of August when kids are supposed to return to schools, there's no place to return to because you can't, if there's no formula for distributing the money, you can't send it out. And that's the legislature's done this by sunsetting the block grant. It begs the question of why did the Senate wait until Thursday of last week to be thinking about a new school finance formula? But that's where we are. So again, the block grant was a failed idea, it was a foolish idea. It did not respond to student needs, it did not respond to demographic changes. If you got more at-risk kids or more bilingual kids, you did not get any more money to help provide programs for those kids. If your enrollment went up, you were out of luck. It was a disastrous idea. It was meant to harm schools in the first place. That was the whole intent behind it. The intent behind the school finance change, behind the adoption of the block grant, was that it would trick the Supreme Court into saying, let's just throw Gannon out because it's not the same school finance formula, and start the whole legal process over again. The court, to its credit, said, no, we see what you're doing. You tried this, you fooled us once before on this, we're not falling for it again. and no, we're not going to let this go, and they went ahead and ruled. So fortunately we had that. I want to thank all of you too, by the way, who did something about retaining Supreme Court justices in the last election. Because if that effort had failed, we'd be in a way different world right now than we are, even with a better legislature. So.
Thank you. We also had a question about helping helping parents with resources in how to help their children and how to teach them at home, or not teach them at home, but help them with their homework and really support their schools at home. Do any of you know about any resources out there for parents, or any momentum?
There are programs in the state, Parents as Teachers, that are meant to do that. I think Tiny K, if there's preschoolers, does a lot with parents as well. There are those groups. There's a Parent Information Resource Center. Communities in Schools is another one that may or may not be in your district. Yeah, so Communities in Schools is a good parent support group and student support group. Parents as Teachers, especially for parents of young children. Tiny K, if you have concerns about your child's development and so on. So there are those. Beyond that, it's just, I know that a lot of education associations, I think we have something on our website that are parent resources that may link you to things, but I don't know how. I've never looked at them, to tell you the truth, so it's not my division. But there are a lot of resources like that. Does the State Department have anything for parents on their website?
I'm sure they have 1,000 things out there, and I haven't been around long enough to dig through all of them, but I know there are a ton of resources on the State Board's website. If I find some, I'll put them in my newsletter for those of you who get that. But the Parents as Teachers, the Communities in Schools is a huge program. I think 501 finally put it in all their schools, but it really focuses on the whole child, because, you know, as they say, you can't do the Bloom stuff if you haven't done the Maslow stuff, you know, because kids come to school with a lot of baggage and teachers have to help them dig through that. But that's what the Community in Schools person does for those kids, is help the family. It's a huge resource for particularly low-income schools, but works for all schools too, because all kids deal with stuff. But in terms of specifics, I can't tell you because I'm just too new at it. What's that on our website? Every day I look, I find new stuff.
I do have one specific to whoever asked the question. You know, the best resource you have is the classroom teacher. And the best thing you can do, you know, you go to parent conferences, you go to back to school night, you go to those things. You know, you can also call your teacher and just say, I need help, I want to talk, give me a conference. And your classroom teacher, your kid's teacher will do that. My grandson is in Lawrence Public Schools, and he's been getting at his school, they have a homework helper thing, that there are teachers that stay. It's been a godsend for his single mother to get him through homework and the skills necessary to do what he needs to do to keep up. Your best resource is to go have a conference with your child's teacher. I would say that's the number one thing. Your teacher wants your kid to succeed every bit as much as you do.
Absolutely. And you guys are going to love this one. We're going to have fun. We had two questions about our president saying that after-school programs have no demonstrable effect. How do you respond to that? And how would his proposed cuts to after-school programs affect Kansas? And it specifically says Douglas County, but I think we can probably speak to Kansas.
I think my first response to the first part would be, oh, bullshit. My grandson's in an after-school program here in Lawrence. It's funded somehow. I don't know if it's federal money or state money or Lawrence money, but it does tremendous things. You know, it's not just that program. It's the school lunch program is destroyed The school lunch program, by the way, that is named McGovern-Dole Student Nutrition Program, because Bob Dole and George McGovern created it as a bipartisan bill ages ago. I'm probably preaching to the choir. This president is a disaster. The proposals he has in his budget for education and for the programs that impact children, seniors, and everybody else are a disaster, no matter how you slice it. I forget how many hundreds of millions of dollars are cut out of the Department of Education, and money that's redistributed into voucher programs and programs that are unaccountable to the general public. Everything this man has done on education so far, from the selection of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Non-Education to this budget, is a disaster. When you're willing to sacrifice nutrition programs in schools, I don't know how many kids get their only hot meal a day in a school. It just pisses me off. So anything we can to fight. When Lynn Jenkins actually says she opposes pieces of this bill, you know it's bad. So.
I might be a little less colorful than Mark in responding to that question. I think it does, for me, really underscore the uncertainty at the federal level and support for programs that really matter to our state and to our communities. Indicates to me that we need to get our fiscal house in order and fast, because there's likely to be a greater amount of costs passed off to states and local communities, and we're not going to be able to absorb them if, I sound like a broken record, we don't have comprehensive tax reform. But this notion about doesn't make a difference, when I think about what we're able to accomplish when we have at-risk kids accessing early education and after-school programs, those kids are 25% more likely, or less likely rather, to drop out of school. They're 40% less likely to become teen parents, graduate from high school, go on to earn college education, reduced criminal costs, all of which saves the state money, makes for more productive citizens. That's really what's at stake if we reduce those opportunities through after-school programs, feeding kids meals, and then addressing their needs through early education. I don't think that the state of Kansas, let alone the federal government, is ready to pick up the tab for any of those areas by shortchanging them. We have one shot when we talk about our kids, and we better get it right. So by taking away those opportunities, we better start looking to increase our corrections budgets, looking to increase our safety net, social safety net programs, cash assistance, and all of those other things, because that's really what's at stake when we take away those opportunities.
Absolutely, and to follow up on that, I know we already got a letter down from DeVos's office this week that the template for ESSA is thrown out. They're going to send us a new one, and the bottom line of all of it is, and we're also going to send you our priorities, and you're going to do it. And so, which of course is going to include more money for school vouchers, less money for public schools, because the president and as you know, as Secretary of Education, don't appreciate public schools. They cut out so many things, and voc ed and all those things that we know make, help students succeed. In Topeka, I was on the United Way board when, as you know, United Ways nationwide decided to stop throwing a little bit of money at a whole bunch of things and focus on one thing that would help the community. In Topeka, we focused on high school graduation, improving that. So you know what we did? We went back and focused on third grade reading, because, you can't fix the high school graduation rate till you fix, third grade. So, but a key part of that was these after-school programs. We all know that the kids who are most at risk have to have these programs to succeed. You have to stay with them all summer. We put in summer programs. We put communities in schools where they were. It's a team sport, and all these things like after-school programs matter. We can't let any of them go.
And we are right on time. I just have to say thank you. We're doing great. The last question, very appropriate, has to do with what committee is dealing with tax reform? How do we support it? And I'd like to say that I really try hard to put this information both on Facebook and on our website, douglascountydems.org. advocacy. Right now, I have a letter that came out from Annie about tax reform under, I believe it's urgent bills, but I will pull that out and we'll just call it tax reform. And anything I get from this group, you can get on their mailing list, and you guys maybe can talk about how to get on your mailing list. I pick that up, I put that on the website. There are times when legislation, it changes fast, and these guys are at the Capitol, and they send out alerts, and I try to get those up as quickly as possible. You can sign up for theirs, you can follow our Facebook, look at our website. We try very hard to keep that updated, but I'll let you guys talk about your individual alerts as well, or systems.
Well, Annie can talk about the tax committees, so I'll just say for ours, if you want to follow anything we do, there are two ways to do it, and I would advocate you do both. One is you follow, I write an almost daily blog kind of out after the legislature's done for the day. It's on the web at underthedomeks.org, underthedomeks.org. You can follow that. You can also sign up for it as an email, but sometimes people inadvertently get dropped off that. So just check underthedomeks.org on a daily basis in the evening, and what you need to know on education issues and union issues is on there. We also have a platform called joinusks.org. That is our, it's an alert system that will send you alerts to your phone when a vote is happening, when things are taking place. So the joinusks.org is the alert system that you can get on with at that point, and I'd recommend both. And then I can be followed on Twitter at Desetti KS. So I tweet from committee rooms, and sometimes in a snarky fashion, but it's fun.
It's almost always in a snarky fashion, actually. I want to sort of step back just a second, because I think the talk about what's happening at the federal level serves as a reminder for me for how far we've come in our state. I think we've learned a great number of lessons over the last 6 years, and we've been down this path of having it rush at us through budget cuts and crazy proposals and things that seem absurd, and we've lived through that, and we've started to have the comeback. I think what happened in 2016 in sending nearly a third of our legislature newly elected, creating an opportunity for a moderate Republican and Democratic coalition to move things like tax reform very early in the session and come just 3 votes shy of overriding the governor's veto, that is significant. The country went one direction and Kansas went another, and it's a long game. We started. We cannot let up. 2016 was important. The 2017 legislative session is going to be critical, but so are the following years, and we cannot stop. We made significant progress in a governor who was first elected by a 30-point margin, re-elected by a 4-point margin, and all of his extremist friends were sent packing, who were challenged in either the primaries or the general election. So we're really just getting started in our state. It's important that we remain vigilant throughout and continue to bring our neighbors throughout Kansas along with us, because that change in August and November of 2016, it wasn't just in the population centers. It was in places like my hometown in Hutchinson, and out west in Garden City, and down in the southeast part of the state in Pittsburgh, and in Hayes. We stand a real chance to get back to our progressive roots, to remember who we were. There was a famous Pulitzer Prize winning Civil War historian who said, "When Kansas asserts herself, the whole world knows it." And I believe that we asserted ourselves in 2016, and we're really just getting started. So to that end, tax reform, it has to happen in 2017, because if it doesn't, 2018 will be something that will be so unimaginable from a budget dumpster fire perspective. So riseupkansas.org is the umbrella group that includes Dwayne Gosen and the Kansas Center for Economic Growth, Kansas Action for Children, KNEA, Kansas Organization of State Employees, the Kansas Contractors Association. That's the merry band of fools that have been pushing for tax reform since last legislative session. And it's not about a specific proposal, but it's about achieving a turnaround from the failed experiment that the governor set us down on in 2012. I believe that it will happen this legislative session, and then we can begin restoring the health of our state. We will need everyone's push behind that. If it doesn't happen before they go on break in April, that means that we'll come back in the veto session, and things move pretty fast and furiously at that point. We just need 3 votes in the Senate to override the governor's veto. And at this point, it's when we're talking about the need for comprehensive tax reform, it's to fund our schools. It's to make sure that we can ensure quality of life, that we can pay teachers what they're worth, that we can create access to health care. We cut Meals on Wheels a number of years ago. It's to make sure that we can support and fund those programs throughout our state. So riseupkansas.org puts out action alerts, puts out materials from KNEA and Kansas Action for Children and Kansas Center for Economic Growth, and is keeping that group informed about when those tax debates are taking place. We think that they'll probably take another run at comprehensive tax reform and a full, perhaps now look at a full repeal of the Brownback tax policy. But we have to make sure that we close the gap and that we can fund our schools. So that's really the message that we've been pushing. In terms of Kansas Action for Children, we also send out action alerts through our website, and that's kac.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there. Every Friday we put out what's called a Capital Connection, where we update our followers as to what happened that week as it relates to KAC's policy priorities. And then we also will send out individual action alerts.
Thank you. As far as I know, the State Board of Education does not do action alerts. But I know that Senator Francisco and Senator Hensley and I all do newsletters to try to help folks understand what's going on under the dome. And if you don't get my newsletter but would like to, you could write to me at Ann Mah at att.net. That's ANNMAH at att.net. And I try to explain things in a way that helps. Also, you could go to my website, annmah.org, and I have my weekly newsletters posted there. One of them does have a newsletter on the Gannon decision, which lays out the key points and things that I found interesting in it that I think you would too. And that's that.
Senator Francisco has something to add. While she comes up here, I would like to add, I guess, my own, the Douglas County Democrats advocacy group for public education. I am on all these alerts, and so what I do with that group is I will email you whenever these alerts come up. So that's another resource.
Good morning. I just wanted to share that the chair of the Senate Tax Committee told me yesterday that we will be working yet one more tax bill in the tax committee. Tuesday or Wednesday of this week is her prediction for that. She has asked me, and I've given her a list of all the things that I'd like to see included in a tax bill. I'm giving her a little pushback because I am not supporting a flat tax. I think that's one of the things that's going to be proposed. We had a hearing just yesterday, an informational hearing on the earned income tax credit. I think that's an incredibly important piece to keep in our tax plan. The chair, or the majority leader, thinks we could save $20 million if we would eliminate $66 million from low-income people in that refundable credit. There are a couple of things that people may be concerned that I am supporting. Right now, the employee contributions to CAPERS are taxed. The contributions in the other retirement programs at the university, those university professors or unclassified staff, they don't pay taxes on that. I think if we're going to talk about the LLC and secretaries paying taxes when doctors and lawyers are not, we have to do that same thing in our retirement programs at the university. We're taxing secretaries and custodians and not professors and staff. I'd like to get back the refundable part for renters, or actually the homestead program for renters. Right now, we just have it for homeowners. But let me know if there's any specific parts that you'd like to see in our tax package, and I will argue for them in committee. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator. And a further note, our next seminar, which is the third Saturday in April, will be about tax reform. So, and we should have a lot to talk about at that point. Also, if you found this informative, we do film it, as you can see, and we put it on our website, so feel free to share it with your friends. And I have found this session both very powerful and reassuring. Democrats, we have our marching orders. Let's go. Thank you so much to each of you.